A year ago, I picked up a book called Life and Death of American Cities by Jane Jacobs. It was written in 1961, but I found it fascinating to learn that we're still influenced by idealistic and naive ideas that came out of London in the early 1900s. Back then, London was quickly becoming overcrowded. It had a lot of factories, a lot of pollution, and a lot of crime and poverty. Citizens agreed at that point in time that that was their number one issue to take care of was the overcrowding of London. And because the idea of planning for a city didn't occur, these ideas of cities didn't exist until recently. There was a man named Ebenezer Howard, and he came up with this idea of garden cities. If we were only to give people a whole bunch of nature and space, it would solve all of the problems that the city of London had. Now, garden cities intended to be planned, self-contained communities surrounded by these green belts containing an appropriate portion of areas of residencies in industry and agriculture. And you can see that in the diagram here in this circular diagram that came out of Ebenezer Howard's book. In the center of the circular village, you'll have the gardens, as it were, or civic centers. You'll have where people will do their civic duties. You will also have fun and go out to the opera. And then on the outskirts or the next ring out, that is where the citizens would live. And so the citizens would go in either of one of two directions, either into the civic center for nightlife, opera, or to the outskirts of town where they had a whole bunch of commercial centers, the industries. And so the idea would be that we would push all the pollution to the outside of these towns. The ideas for garden cities became so popular that it finally had reached the United States and had influence over many areas that we all know today. Towns like Queens in New York, Hilton Village in New Orleans, areas of Chicago, Arlington, Virginia, right outside of DC, where I spent a lot of my formative years, and Newport News of Virginia. There's actually a town called Garden City, New York, which did not bear his name from this concept, but still inherited some of the concepts of Howard's thinking. Now, there's also other towns like Norris in Tennessee. There's Greendale, Wisconsin, Green Hills, Ohio, and Greenbelt, Maryland, which got its name from the literal green belts that encircled these towns. But there was a really big problem with Howard's design. Because of the overcrowding, he thought that he could just limit the size of towns to 38,000. And it was super idealistic. Why couldn't we just keep people to 38,000? The problem with this is that most cities in the world had already grown much larger than 38,000 people, so there's no real way to actually implement a lot of his ideas. Now, a man named Le Corbusier came up with this idea to take what Howard had built around nature and spacing people out and build on top of it. And he called it the Radiant City. His idea was going to be to build these gigantic skyscrapers that would take a very small amount of land horizontally, but continue to have greenery and the green belts and the parks all built around us. In addition, he would continue to organize the city by segregating out the commercial areas from the residential areas from the industrial areas, building on Howard's ideas. So he would also organize the families in residential areas not by income and social position, but instead by family size. And so they would be clearly separated into their own neighborhoods and very cleverly designed. Now, while all of this sounds great in practice, it has devastating effects in decades in cities across the United States. I mean, who doesn't like the idea of nature and cleanliness and order? It sounds so perfect. Why wouldn't we want that? And why wouldn't it just work? But the reality is that cities don't die on their own, buildings don't die on their own, roads don't die on their own. They die because of humans leaving. They die because of humans letting them die. At the same time, cities live because humans breathe life into those cities. And like any living organism, it is not a single cell that does the work. It is a complicated set of relationships between the people that determine its success. And this is what we call community. There's a lot of learning we can apply from the failures of city planning in our open source communities that we've already experienced in our cities here in the United States. So why don't we take a second here to dive into some of these problems and how Jane Jacobs talked about fixing them. So first we'll talk about security, safety, and defects. The first problem is how safety is actually accomplished in these cities. Contrary to popular belief, police don't prevent crime, but are necessary. It's actually primarily done through social norms, standards, and the culture of the people themselves who monitor the sidewalks and the streets of these neighborhoods. When that culture is broken down, there's no amount of policing or guards that can prevent that crime. It would be an enormous amount of money, and it just wouldn't work. In the decades following the 1900s, we've seen that an increase in police budgets does not have a proportional decrease in crime. So while social distancing is good for the pandemic, spreading the population out the way that Le Corbusier and Howard suggested does not solve security. If that was the case, a city like Los Angeles would be extremely safe since it's basically a suburban-like city. Everything is extremely safe out, it's spread out. But we know that that isn't the case. LA still has crime, and there are still dangerous areas of LA. Now, these were the fundamental flaws in the Radiant and the Garden City. Due to these overcrowded cities, they believed that just giving more space to individuals meant more privacy and security. But we know that something is implicitly true. When you look at these two streets in these slides, you'll see that there is one street that is well lit, and you'll see another street that is well lit. But the main difference between one street and the other street is that one street is completely empty, and the other street has a bunch of people. And we as humans inherently know to shy away from that street that may be well lit and go towards the street that has a lot of people. So we also know that just keeping streets with well lit lights does not deter crime. But what we do know is that eyeballs on these streets and strangers, yes, strangers, is actually what keeps our cities safe. Now, your parents don't want me to tell you that, but strangers do keep it safe because that's what makes those alleyways and sidewalks safe are the eyeballs of those strangers. And as long as there's a strong sense of standards, social norms, and cultures on those streets and in those neighborhoods, that strangers actually add to reinforce the culture and the social norms. And the same could be said about open source projects. If we want secure, bugless products and projects and communities, we actually need eyeballs just as much as those city streets do. In fact, one of the earliest open source mantras was based on a concept that was created in 1999 by Eric S. Raymond. He created Linus's Law in the book he called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. That was created almost 20 years ago. And what he stated was, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And coincidentally, he referred to open source projects as bazaars or marketplaces, things where the community goes to exchange. So as I'm reading this book and making the analogies to open source and city planning, Eric Raymond was doing the exact same thing 20 years ago. And what he's really saying is, given enough contributors and users looking at our projects, we'll be able to find all of the security holes and bugs associated with it. And if we're lucky enough, we might have a chance to fix them with the same group of people. So if eyeballs are so important to both cities and open source communities, how do we get more eyeballs? So the first is clearly defining private and public areas, not just the streets, but also the storefronts, the buildings. We must know what is public and private. There can be no gray area as there are in suburban neighborhoods. When you step onto someone's grass, you don't know whether it belongs to the government or that grumpy old man that lives inside. That's okay in a suburban area, but it's not okay for the city. Because as strangers, because those are what we want to draw into our streets to keep them safe, they want to know what they can interact with. Without that clear demarcation, strangers will be left unsure on how to interact with those public spaces altogether and not come to your neighborhood at all. In open source, we have the same issue, and we are experiencing that today. We can equate this to private and public spaces till the licenses our open source technology uses. The licenses that we use in open source, whether it be the GPL or the Apache license, it doesn't really matter. The important thing that matters is that we can clearly delineate or demarcate what belongs to the private entity or what belongs in public spaces. And we're seeing this play out with Google and Oracle today. The main argument around public APIs, definitions, and its public use will define how we use open source for time to come. And enterprises hate risk. So when you cannot properly define public or private spaces, you are essentially giving the enterprises risk. And so they'd rather not use your project at all. So just like in cities, open source needs clearly defined private and public spaces. The next thing we need for a good city is skin in the game, right? We need people who care about that street. We need residents who care about it, shop owners who care about it, because inherently a shop owner wants to keep their street safe and clean and neighborhoods safe and clean, right? They care about it. It is their well-being, is how they make their money. The same thing needs to be happening in open source. Like Spinnaker and Netflix, Netflix uses Spinnaker to deploy their software thousands of times a day. They need it to be safe and secure and need it to work well. I work at a company called Armory, and we need the exact same thing, right? We depend on the open source community. So we have skin in the game like Netflix and others. And the reason you need that is because we are the ones who are going to start defining those social norms that these strangers who come by and see our project and see our neighborhood will also fall into. And lastly, we need continuous use. Nobody enjoys looking at an empty street, right? If eyeballs are what we need to keep us safe, then we need something to look at. Otherwise, we'll just go inside and turn around. Right? Consider the neighborhood or the district of Wall Street in New York City in the 60s. It was mostly a quiet place, surprisingly, with the exception of 9 to 5. And even then, it was fairly quiet because people were in their offices, right? They would go out for their lunchtime. So from 12 to 2, the commercial shops and the restaurants would get these rushes. But other than that, it was pretty quiet. And during those periods of times, there was a lot of crime and poverty in those areas. Stores would shut down and turn over very, very quickly because you didn't know when the next customer was going to come unless it was 12 to 2. And it was a really sad story because if you think about where Wall Street is in New York, it's great. It's right next to the harbor. And it's also right next to Lady Liberty, which is a great thing to look at. And yet it still suffered from crime. And the reality is that we just like other people. We like watching other people. It's innate in us, it's human nature to be surrounded by other people. And so, in order to have eyeballs on your city and on your project, you need to attract as many people as possible. All right, so now we know that we need to attract as many people as possible. Why don't we try to understand why people join communities? Now, as I started digging into the similarities between open source and city planning, Chrissy Costa, one of our investors, suggested I read this book, The Making and Maintenance of Open Source Software by Nadia Eghbal. Now, if you haven't heard of this and you're really interested in learning more about the research that she did while she was at GitHub, I strongly suggest that you grab this book. Now, she defined 4 major reasons why people work on open source. Number 1, they just want to solve a problem. Interestingly enough, open source for most people is not an end, but a means to an end, right? They are just trying to get their work done and they have reached a problem that they cannot solve with existing solutions. The second reason why people work in open source is reputation. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, number 3 down from the top is just having peer recognition. And just the idea of having eyeballs on you is something that we strive for as humans as well. And because all of this is done in public, it's anybody is able to see you and you can gain notoriety from that. And we've seen a huge growth in this in the last 10 years. Number 3, I feel like I belong here. Now, this is really about the community and the values that it holds. And this one particularly speaks to me. Each open source community has its own culture, how to prioritize its features, its work, contributors, types of events. And these are all the reasons I continue to come back to the Spinnaker community. And the last one and the most important one is it's a lot of fun. If you're anything like myself, I love the code. I actually use it as a break from the day-to-day activities that I have, and there are others who do as well. Being able to tackle problems that are outside of your domain are interesting and challenging and fun, and people go gravitate towards that. The same reasons why we gravitate towards open source and use open source can be said about why people join cities. They have problems to solve. I need a job opportunity. I need a better education, better living conditions. I need to be close to family, right? All of these things are problems that need to be solved, and cities draw us to that. The second, which is the same as open source, is reputation, right? If you want to be a fashion designer, you're likely going to spend some time in Milan. If you want to be a cook, you're going to spend some time in France, in Paris. If you want to be an actor, you're going to go to Hollywood or LA. If you want to be in finance, you'll go to New York City or London. All of these reasons are why people go there, is to build their reputation, to build their careers. And of course, just like in open source, the community. And just like that spoke to me about the Spinnaker community, when I first went to San Francisco in the early 2000s, of course, I was excited about the career opportunities and the job opportunities. But at that point in time, I really felt like San Francisco was the city for me based on their cultural values and what they stood for. And then the last one, it's fun. If you've ever been to Vegas, Miami, or New Orleans, you completely understand why you'd want to move there. As a young guy, I wanted to move to Miami. I didn't make that happen, but that's one of the reasons why people go. All right. So from there, let's talk about how we classify open source projects. Now, this is important for us to understand how open source projects are created. And as I'm reading this book that was suggested to me, Nadia goes to describe how there are different projects and what classifies them. And I came to realize that not all of the analogies that I'm making today applies to all open source projects. So she says that there are four types of projects, which are federations, clubs, stadiums, and toys. Federations have high user growth, high contributor growth. You can see this in projects like Linux, Kubernetes, and even Spinnaker. They accommodate a ton of different use cases. And that is the analogies that I'm making today. Clubs have low user growth relative to its high number of contributors. For example, AstroPi. Now, unless you're an astrophysicist, it's unlikely you're going to use this project. But if you are an astrophysicist, it's likely you are going to contribute to that project. Stadiums have high user growth, but low contributor growth. And Babel is a good example of this, as well as something like OpenSSH. OpenSSH is used by pretty much everybody today, and it's being used in your laptop today if you own a Mac. But it's very unlikely that you know anybody who contributes to that. So we Spinnaker are a federation, and this is why it's important to denote that. It's also important because the community means a lot to us because we're an abstraction above the clouds. As the clouds continue to pour billions of dollars in innovation, we also need to keep up with that innovation. And it's critical that we do so, and we rely on the community to do so. So next, we think about governance. Now, for the most part, communities are actually self-governed or have a light set of governance from the community itself or city hall. Now, as much as we want to try and contain and organize cities in the way that Howard and Debussy did, it's incredibly hard to do so and typically leads to undesirable results. The idea of how we create neighborhoods in New York City is not somebody from the top, but instead how they self-organize to create those neighborhoods based on identity. Now, at the base of it all for governments, we have people. Above that, we have the neighborhoods that they have selected themselves into. And above that, we do have something really important called districts. Now, the reason districts are so critical to cities is because districts are the way to influence City Hall. You know, when they wanted to knock down Carnegie Hall in New York City, the neighborhood where Carnegie Hall existed could not fight City Hall on its own. It had to use the district power to prevent Carnegie Hall from being dropped. And that's what we have. Now, on the open source side, we have a very similar story. We have people who work on features. Those features alone are not enough to kind of move other folks around. So instead, we bubble those up into SIGs. Those SIGs have more power and influence based on who's running them in the community. So things like cross-cutting concerns like security can be brought up to the steering committee and the TOC. From there, we go into diversity. And now that we've established why people go and what keeps us safe, and how do we kind of get these cities to change, we go into what Jane Jacobs in her book says is her central argument of the entire book. And it's about diversity. And she says that the ubiquitous principle is so close-grained diversity of uses that give each other constant mutual support, both economically and socially. And this is really important. It's not just our diverse social backgrounds that need to be thought of, although that is critical as well, but also our differences in economic backgrounds, from poor to rich, from finance to fashion. A city needs to support all of these diverse use cases. So if we go back to Wall Street, one of the main problems was this lack of diversity. There's one thing and one thing only you went to Wall Street for, and that was for finance. You didn't go there for fashion. You didn't go there for food. You didn't go there for anything else. And so it suffered a really great problem for a long period of time until that changed. You can also think about the way that people use sidewalks, right? Sidewalks themselves need diverse uses. Larger sidewalks are going to make way for kids playing, wanting to jump rope. They're also going to make way for people who may want to sell hot dogs. Smaller sidewalks make use cases for different reasons. You can also think about buildings. You need old buildings just as much as you need new buildings. New buildings are going to be more expensive and attract different types of use cases. Old buildings are going to make way for people who are not as developers, trying to start new companies, new businesses, and who can't afford those new buildings, right? They're going to be able to breathe life back into those old buildings. So the more you think about communities and the importance of these interconnectivity, you can think of the same thing in open source. And we need diversity in the same way. We need different social backgrounds because those different social backgrounds that come into our community will help us build a better product. They will come with different use cases, right? That initial primary diversity that comes in that social backgrounds will help us build that second use case in diversity around building a better product, a more diverse, more usable product. And the more diverse we are, and the more use cases that we can handle, the more sustainable our community will be, and the more sustainable our cities will be. So after that, we start thinking about blocks, streets, highways, and subways, because this is how we get around in our city. Now, Lavoisier's vision for cars was that we would have these major thoroughfares where most cars would be pushed towards them. This leaves the city with these very long blocks, and in some cases, this idea of super blocks. Now, the problem with this is that it leaves very little room for sporadic and random use. For example, if I need to go to 50th Street and I live on 88th Street, I'm most likely going to be pushed down 6th Avenue where everybody's going. It wouldn't make sense for me to go down the other roads. Now, if I go into the next slide and I show you by simply cutting the block size in half, we create 4 different paths that I can possibly take down to get to 6th Avenue, allowing for more spontaneous exploration. And so interestingly enough, what we're looking for here is not about a single path from start to finish, but as many paths as possible. Because having as many paths as possible will allow us to see and experience different blocks, and we can keep these other blocks safe merely by passing through them and through that exploration. And so just like our cities, we have to think about that destination in a not one size fits all model. People coming from VMs or bare metal are going to have a very different experience than if you came from containers. And not only is this good, but it's desirable. It goes back to diversity. A bunch of different entry points and pathways we have to our proverbial city we call Spinnaker. You know, I spent some time with Roz and Nakima, and we built a map of how users go in and out of Spinnaker. So this slide shows all the different ways that we thought of how people go in and out. At first, though, 4 years ago, none of this existed. There was barely a website with documentation. Many of these paths did not exist. But I'm really proud that we as a community have built them and have invested in them over the last 4 years, because that is what makes our community sustainable. So, like Spinnaker, cities are platforms, a platform to create and share new ideas with other people in your community, and to do so safely while pursuing happiness. You know, without these stronger communities, American cities die, and so do open source communities. But when we learn from our past and our neighboring domains like city planning, we can create communities that are self-sustaining and can thrive. You know, when we started Armory 4 years ago, we saw a continuous delivery tool that was years ahead of everybody else. And we wanted to build on top of that platform. What we were unaware of at the time was how impactful these communities were going to be to this project. And there's a saying by Brett Cannon from the Python community, and it goes like this: I came for the language, but stayed for the community. And I could truly say the same for Spinnaker. I came for the best software delivery tool, but stayed for the community. Thank you.